When a master's wife fell for a strong young slave, their forbidden passion would shake the foundations of a Kansas plantation in 1843. Elizabeth Hartwell, trapped in a loveless marriage, found herself irresistibly drawn to Isaiah, a man whose mind and spirit remained unbroken despite his chains. Their dangerous attraction ignited a fire that would consume everything around them. What began as stolen glances across the dinner table would escalate into a desperate affair that challenged the brutal hierarchy of the antebellum South. But in a world where their love was the deadliest crime imaginable, the price of their passion would be paid in blood. Elizabeth Hartwell stood at the window of her Kansas plantation home, staring out at the endless prairie with empty eyes. Her Boston upbringing had never prepared her for this desolate life, married to a man whose only passion was for power and profit. James Hartwell's latest acquisition was being led across the yard. A tall, muscular slave from Missouri named Isaiah. "This one's educated," James announced later that evening. Previous master was one of those liberal types. Taught him to read, write, even some mathematics. Paid good money for that mistake. Elizabeth felt Isaiah's eyes on her at dinner that night. Not lustful or threatening, but observant, intelligent. When she dropped her napkin, he retrieved it with graceful hands that didn't belong to a field worker. "Thank you," she whispered, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. "My pleasure, ma'am," he replied, his voice cultured and deep. James slammed his fist on the table. "You speak when spoken to, boy." But something had already passed between them. A recognition, a dangerous spark of connection that neither could deny. In the following weeks, Elizabeth found reasons to be in the garden when Isaiah tended the roses. Their conversations, though brief, revealed his extraordinary mind. Poetry, philosophy, even politics discussed in hushed tones between pruning and planting. "How did you learn so much?" she asked one afternoon, hidden behind a trellis of climbing roses. "My former master's wife taught me in secret," he said. "Knowledge is the one thing they can't take from you, even when they own your body." Elizabeth felt a shameful thrill at his words, at the intensity in his eyes when he spoke of freedom. Each day she found herself drawn more to the garden, to the man whose spirit remained unbroken despite his chains. Her heart raced when she heard his footsteps on the gravel path, her cheeks flushing when their eyes met across the dinner table. What Elizabeth didn't yet understand was that every glance exchanged between them was being carefully watched, and the price of her awakening desire would be paid in blood. James Hartwell's departure for a 3-week business trip to St. Louis left Elizabeth with a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. The plantation seemed to exhale in his absence, the very air growing lighter, without his watchful presence. The rigid schedule he imposed relaxed, and even the house slaves moved with less trepidation through the halls of the main house. "I've instructed Overseer Miller to keep a close eye on things," James had said before mounting his horse. His gaze lingered on Isaiah, who stood at attention nearby, face carefully blank but shoulders tensed under the scrutiny. "Especially on our more valuable property." The way he emphasized the word property made Elizabeth's stomach turn. After watching her husband's figure disappear down the long drive, Elizabeth retreated to her sitting room, opening the windows to let in the fresh spring air that seemed to carry possibility on its breeze. She found herself glancing more often toward the gardens where Isaiah worked, his strong back bent over the rose beds her husband had imported at great expense from England. Roses she had never wanted but had been forced to pretend to adore. The day after James's departure, a summer storm swept across the Kansas prairie with little warning. The sky darkened to an ominous purple-gray, and the wind picked up, bending the tall grasses surrounding the plantation house. Elizabeth stood at her bedroom window, watching the approaching tempest with a strange excitement, when movement in the garden caught her eye. Isaiah was rushing between the beds, frantically covering the tender seedlings with burlap sacks. Without thinking, Elizabeth grabbed a shawl and hurried downstairs and out the back door. The first heavy drops were already falling as she lifted her skirts and ran across the lawn. "Let me help you," she offered, rushing to his side without her usual parasol or gloves, those symbols of gentility and separation. Isaiah looked up, surprise evident in his eyes. "Mrs. Hartwell, you shouldn't. The storm." "I don't care about the storm," she said, grabbing a piece of burlap from the pile. "Show me what to do." They worked side by side, the rain quickly soaking through their clothes, plastering fabric to skin. Elizabeth's carefully arranged hair came loose, falling in wet tendrils around her face. She found herself laughing as they raced against the downpour, a kind of wild freedom in her abandonment of propriety. When the last plant was protected, they stood breathless in the rain, water streaming down their faces. Elizabeth couldn't remember the last time she had felt so alive, so present in her own body. Isaiah was looking at her with an expression of wonder, as if seeing something entirely new. "We should get inside," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the thunder that rolled across the sky. The garden shed was the closest shelter. Isaiah hesitated at the door, clearly aware of the impropriety, but another crash of thunder decided for them. Inside, the small space forced them into proximity. The scent of damp earth, wet cotton, and something indefinably masculine filled Elizabeth's senses. Rain drummed on the wooden roof, creating a cocoon of sound that seemed to separate them from the world outside. Elizabeth became acutely aware of Isaiah's breathing, of the droplets of rain trailing down his face, catching in his eyelashes. In the dim light filtering through the single small window, she could see the rise and fall of his chest beneath his sodden shirt. "You have soil on your cheek," he said softly, breaking the charged silence between them. Before she could stop herself, Elizabeth reached up to touch his face, ostensibly to brush away dirt, but her fingers lingered against his warm skin. Isaiah froze, his eyes widening with a mixture of fear and something else, something that mirrored the dangerous heat blooming in her own chest. "Mrs. Hartwell," he whispered, a warning in his voice. His eyes darted to the door, to the world beyond that would condemn them both for even this innocent touch. "Elizabeth," she corrected, her hand still on his cheek. "My name is Elizabeth." The words felt like a confession, an offering of herself beyond the role society had assigned her. The thunder crashed outside as his hand cautiously rose to cover hers. That single touch, forbidden and electric, crossed every boundary between them. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they stood connected by nothing more than the press of palm against palm, her pale fingers against his dark skin. "This is dangerous," Isaiah murmured, but he didn't pull away. His eyes held a lifetime of caution, of necessary restraint, yet beneath it burned something that called to the emptiness inside her. "I know," she whispered back, and she did know, knew exactly what could happen to a slave who was even suspected of impropriety with the master's wife, knew what society would think of her for seeing a slave as a man worthy of her touch, yet the knowledge did nothing to diminish the current flowing between them. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the shed door, breaking the spell. Isaiah stepped back, putting a respectful distance between them. The moment passed, but something fundamental had shifted in Elizabeth's world. "The rain is letting up," he said, his voice steady but his eyes still holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You should return to the house before you catch a chill." Elizabeth nodded, suddenly aware of her transparent wet clothing, of her unbound hair, of how utterly undone she must appear. "Yes, of course. Thank you for your help with the garden." The formality of her words seemed absurd after what had passed between them, but Isaiah nodded gravely, accepting the return to their proper roles. He opened the door, checking that no one was about before stepping aside to let her pass. Later, lying sleepless in her empty bed, Elizabeth tried to convince herself it had been nothing. A momentary madness brought on by the storm, by loneliness, by her husband's absence. The proper thing would be to forget it entirely, to maintain the distance their respective positions demanded. In the days that followed, Isaiah seemed to have reached the same conclusion. He kept to the fields rather than the gardens, averting his eyes when serving at dinner, responding to her few attempts at conversation with polite, impersonal replies. Elizabeth told herself this was for the best, even as she found herself watching for him from windows, manufacturing reasons to walk past where he worked. The household settled into an uneasy rhythm. Overseer Miller, true to James's instructions, kept a watchful eye on all the slaves, but particularly on Isaiah. Elizabeth noticed the man's suspicious glances, the way he seemed to materialize whenever she ventured near the quarters or the fields. His presence was a constant reminder of the precarious nature of their situation. A week into her husband's absence, Elizabeth retreated to her bedroom early, claiming a headache to escape the stifling presence of Miller, who had taken to dining at the main house in James's absence. As she prepared for bed, a flash of white caught her eye. There on her windowsill, placed with careful precision, lay a small book of poetry, one she recognized from her own library. With trembling fingers, she opened it to find a page marked with a pressed rose petal. A single line was underlined in the faintest of pencil marks. "The heart has reasons that reason cannot know." Elizabeth sank onto her bed, the book clutched to her chest, her heart racing with fear and exhilaration. The message was clear, and so was the risk Isaiah had taken to deliver it. If anyone had seen him near her bedroom window, she should burn the book, she knew, destroy this evidence of their dangerous connection. Instead, she slipped it beneath her pillow where her fingers could touch it in the darkness, a tangible link to the man who had awakened something long dormant within her. The next morning, she found reason to visit the stables, where Isaiah had been reassigned to work with the horses. Their eyes met briefly over the back of a chestnut mare. "The roses need attention," she said, loudly enough for the stable boy to hear. "Some appear to be suffering from the recent rains." Isaiah nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "I'll see to them this afternoon, ma'am." That simple exchange, innocent to any observer, carried the weight of their shared secret. The anticipation of their meeting hummed through Elizabeth's veins as she returned to the house, both terrified and exhilarated by what might come. But the fire they had ignited couldn't be extinguished by mere denial, and their next encounter would shatter the last barriers between them forever. As the afternoon approached, Elizabeth knew she stood on the precipice of a choice that would alter the course of both their lives irrevocably. The proper, Boston-bred wife she had been raised to be warned her to retreat, to maintain the boundaries that kept their world orderly and safe. But the woman she was becoming, the woman who had tasted a moment of genuine connection after years of emptiness, urged her forward into uncharted and dangerous territory. The garden at dusk held a different quality of light, softer, more forgiving than the harsh Kansas sun. Elizabeth made her way through the rose beds, ostensibly inspecting the damage from the recent storm. Her hair was simply styled, her dress one of her plainer ones, though she had taken care with the lavender water at her wrists and throat. Her heart fluttered with anticipation and fear, each step carrying her further from the woman she had been raised to be. Isaiah was kneeling by the white roses, his strong hands carefully pruning away storm damage. The muscles in his forearms flexed with each precise cut, his movements displaying the skill of someone who understood the delicate balance between nurturing and culling. He rose when he heard her approach, his face carefully composed into the mask he wore for survival. "The Duchess of Albany roses survived well," he said formally, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "But the tea roses will need special attention. The rain has damaged several of the young buds." Elizabeth nodded, acutely aware of Overseer Miller watching from the distance, his suspicious gaze following her movements. She had noticed how the man had taken to patrolling the gardens more frequently since James's departure, as if sensing some disturbance in the careful hierarchy of the plantation. "Show me what needs to be done," she replied with practiced detachment. "I want to know which varieties we might need to replace." They moved deeper into the garden where trellises heavy with climbing roses created a natural enclosure hidden from the main house. The sweet perfume of the blooms surrounded them, nature's own conspiracy providing them cover. Only when they were shielded from view did Isaiah's professional demeanor soften, the careful blankness giving way to a cautious warmth that made Elizabeth's breath catch. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly, though his eyes betrayed his words. "Miller's been watching me like a hawk. Yesterday, he questioned me about why I was working in the library when your husband specifically assigned me to field work." "What did you tell him?" Elizabeth asked, concern tightening her chest. "That Mrs. Hartwell requested help cataloging some botanical texts," Isaiah replied. "He didn't seem satisfied, but he couldn't contradict what might have been your direct order." Elizabeth nodded, making a mental note to confirm this story if asked. "I received your message," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The poetry book." A shadow of worry crossed Isaiah's face. "I shouldn't have taken such a risk. If anyone had seen me near your quarters—" "No one did," she assured him, though she couldn't know this for certain. Isaiah's expression grew serious, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her feel both seen and exposed. "Mrs. Hartwell, Elizabeth, what happened in the shed? We both know it can't happen again." "Can't it?" The boldness of her own question shocked her. The proper Elizabeth Hartwell, daughter of a respected Boston merchant, wife of a Kansas plantation owner, would never speak so forwardly, would never stand so close to a man not her husband, would certainly never feel this dangerous heat spreading through her body at his proximity. "You know what would happen to me," Isaiah said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. His hand unconsciously moved to his shoulder, where Elizabeth knew scars from previous punishments marked his skin. "What would happen to you?" Elizabeth did know. The punishment for a slave who dared to touch a white woman was death, often slow and public. The neighboring plantation had held such an execution just last year, forcing all slaves to watch as a warning. And for her, social ruin at best, violence at worst. James Hartwell was not a man who would tolerate any slight to his honor or ownership. "I've never felt alive before," she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Not until that day in the shed. Not until you." She paused, gathering courage. "All my life I've done what was expected of me. I was the dutiful daughter who married where her father directed, the obedient wife who moved west when her husband decided, leaving behind everyone and everything I knew. I've lived behind a mask as surely as you have." Isaiah closed his eyes briefly, as if in pain. When he opened them, the raw emotion there made her breath catch. There was longing, yes, but also fear, not for himself alone, but for her. "I've spent my whole life being careful," he said, his deep voice barely audible above the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze, "learning to hide every thought, every feeling. My last master's wife taught me to read because she was bored and wanted someone to discuss books with. For 2 years, I lived for those afternoons when she would call me to the parlor while her husband was away." He looked past Elizabeth, lost in memory. "She introduced me to Shakespeare, to Milton, to the Greek philosophers. For the first time, I encountered ideas that matched the thoughts in my own head, thoughts I'd been told a slave had no right to have." "What happened?" Elizabeth asked, though from his expression she feared she knew. "Her husband returned early one day, found us reading Voltaire together." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "He had me whipped until I couldn't stand. 20 lashes for each book she'd given me. I counted 60 before I lost consciousness." Elizabeth reached out instinctively, her fingers hovering just above the fabric of his shirt, knowing what scars must lie beneath. The urge to touch him, to somehow heal those wounds, was almost overwhelming. "When I recovered," Isaiah continued, "I was put up for auction. That's where your husband found me. He paid extra because I was educated. Said a slave who could read and write could help manage accounts and correspondence. Then I was sold here," he went on, where your husband made it clear that my education made me valuable but dangerous. One wrong word, one hint that I think of myself as anything but property, and—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I hate this place," Elizabeth whispered fiercely. "I hate what it does to people. What it's done to you. What it's done to me." She hadn't realized how much truth was in these words until she spoke them aloud. The plantation that had seemed merely foreign and unwelcoming when she first arrived now felt like a prison, its beauty a thin veneer over cruelty and oppression. "You're the master's wife," Isaiah reminded her gently, though his eyes softened at her declaration. "I'm a possession too," she countered, the realization crystallizing as she spoke. "Brought here to bear children and manage his household. No different from the fine horses in his stable or the imported furniture in his parlor." Something shifted in Isaiah's expression. Recognition, perhaps, of a truth they shared despite the vast gulf between their circumstances. In that moment, the artificial barriers between them seemed to thin, revealing the simple humanity they each recognized in the other. "The book you sent," Elizabeth said, changing the course, her fingers twisting nervously in her skirts. "Pascal. The heart has reasons that reason cannot know. Is that how you feel?" Instead of answering, Isaiah reached out slowly, giving her time to step away. When she didn't, his fingers brushed a strand of hair from her face with exquisite gentleness. The touch was feather-light, yet Elizabeth felt it like a brand against her skin. "Every moment with you is another lash waiting to happen," he murmured, his voice a mixture of resignation and desire. "And still, I can't stay away." The confession hung between them, dangerous and intoxicating. Elizabeth knew she should turn and walk back to the house, maintain the boundary that kept them both safe. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her body making a decision her mind was still struggling with. "Isaiah," she breathed, his name a prayer and a plea. The sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment. They sprang apart as Miller's voice called out, "Mrs. Hartwell, are you still in the garden, ma'am?" Elizabeth smoothed her skirts with trembling hands, forcing her breathing to steady. "I'm inspecting the storm damage," she called back, her voice remarkably composed despite her racing heart. "I'll be returning to the house shortly." Isaiah had already returned to pruning, his face once again an expressionless mask, the transformation so complete it was as if their intimate conversation had never happened. Only his eyes, when they briefly met hers, revealed the turmoil beneath. "We'll continue this discussion tomorrow," she said loudly, for Miller's benefit. "I want a full accounting of which plants need replacing." Isaiah nodded, deferentially, his posture now that of a servant addressing his mistress. "Yes, ma'am. I'll have the list prepared for your review." As Elizabeth walked back toward the house, passing Miller with a cool nod, she felt something unfamiliar unfurling within her, something that felt dangerously like hope. For the first time since her marriage, she began to imagine a different life, a different world, a world where she could choose her own fate. That night, she dreamed of running across endless prairie, Isaiah's hand in hers, no boundaries before them but the distant horizon. She woke with tears on her cheeks and his name on her lips, the phantom sensation of his touch still lingering on her skin. Morning brought unwelcome news. A messenger arrived at breakfast with a letter from James. He would be returning in 3 days, not 1 week as originally planned. His business had concluded early, and he was eager to return to oversee the wheat harvest. Elizabeth's hands trembled so badly that she spilled her tea, earning a disapproving look from Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper. "Are you unwell, ma'am?" the older woman asked, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Just a slight headache," Elizabeth lied, dabbing at the spilled tea with her napkin. "And surprised by my husband's early return, of course." Mrs. Winters nodded, though something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "I'll inform the staff to begin preparations. Mr. Hartwell will expect everything to be in perfect order." Elizabeth felt time closing in around her like a vice. 3 days of freedom, and then back to the suffocating reality of her marriage. 3 days to decide what this fragile, dangerous connection with Isaiah meant, and what she was willing to risk for it. The morning dragged endlessly as Elizabeth went through the motions of her usual routine, reviewing household accounts with Mrs. Winters, instructing the cook about meals for the coming week, writing correspondence that she could barely focus on. All the while, her mind kept returning to Isaiah, to the gentle touch of his fingers against her cheek, to the pain and longing in his eyes. That afternoon, she could bear it no longer. She penned a brief note and summoned one of the house slaves, a young girl named Bessie who had always been kind to Elizabeth. "Take this to the fields," she instructed, pressing the folded paper into the girl's hand. "Give it directly to Isaiah, no one else. Can you do that without being seen?" Bessie's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I can say I'm bringing water to the field hands." "Thank you," Elizabeth said, impulsively squeezing the girl's hand. "This is important." The note was simple. "The conservatory plants need attention. Send Isaiah after dinner." The conservatory, attached to the east wing of the house, had been Elizabeth's pet project since arriving at the plantation. James indulged her interest in exotic plants as a suitable hobby for a gentleman's wife, though he rarely set foot in the humid, glass-enclosed space. It had become her sanctuary, the one place on the plantation that felt truly hers. The hours until dinner passed with excruciating slowness. Elizabeth picked at her food, unable to eat, her stomach knotted with anticipation and fear. Miller dined with her, as he had each night in James's absence, his conversation a tedious mixture of plantation business and thinly veiled complaints about the slaves' work ethic. "That new man, Isaiah," he said at one point, watching Elizabeth's face carefully. "He's educated above his station. Those ones are always trouble." Elizabeth kept her expression neutral with effort. "My husband values his skills," she replied evenly. "As do I. His knowledge of horticulture has been most helpful with my conservatory." Miller grunted, unconvinced. "Just watch yourself around him, ma'am. There's something in his eyes I don't trust. Too much thinking going on behind them." After dinner, as the summer twilight lingered in the sky, Elizabeth dismissed her maid early, claiming fatigue. "I have a headache and wish to retire early. No need to return later. I can manage on my own." Once alone, instead of preparing for bed, she changed into a simpler dress that she could fasten herself, letting her hair down from its pins to fall loose around her shoulders. Heart pounding, she made her way through the quiet house to the conservatory, lighting only a single lamp that cast long shadows among the lush foliage. The glass walls of the conservatory gleamed in the fading light, the exotic plants within creating a lush, private world. Elizabeth moved among them, trailing her fingers over velvety leaves and delicate blossoms. This had been her refuge since coming to Kansas, a place where she could pretend, if only for a little while, that she was somewhere else entirely. When Isaiah arrived, entering through the external door as workers typically did, he found her waiting among the orchids and ferns, her hair loose around her shoulders, her expression a mixture of vulnerability and determination. He closed the door carefully behind him, his eyes never leaving her face. "You shouldn't have sent for me," he said, though his presence belied his words. "The house servants will talk." "They think you're tending the plants," Elizabeth replied, moving closer to him. "As you often do." "Not at this hour." His eyes never left her face, though she knew her state of undress. Her loose hair, the simple dress without corset or crinoline, must be shocking to him. "Not with you dressed like this." Elizabeth moved closer, emboldened by the knowledge of her husband's impending return and the growing certainty that she could not return to her former life. "In 3 days, James will be back. Everything will return to how it was before. I'll be the proper Mrs. Hartwell again, trapped in a marriage without love, without passion." "Elizabeth," Isaiah warned, but he didn't step away. In the lamplight, his face was a study in conflicting emotions, desire warring with caution, hope with bitter experience. "Just once," she whispered, close enough now to feel the heat radiating from his body. "Just once. I want to know what it feels like to be touched by someone who sees me. Really sees me." Isaiah's control visibly wavered. His hands clenched at his sides, his breathing quickened. "If we're discovered—" "We won't be," she promised, though she had no right to make such a promise. "Everyone's retired for the night. Miller's in town until morning." This last part was true. She had overheard the overseer telling Mrs. Winters he had business in town and wouldn't return until the following day. When Isaiah still hesitated, torn between desire and self-preservation, Elizabeth made the decision for them both. She closed the final distance between them and pressed her lips to his. For one terrible moment, he remained frozen, and she feared she had catastrophically misread everything between them. Then, with a sound like a man drowning, Isaiah's arms came around her, pulling her against him as he returned her kiss with a passion that stole her breath. His lips were soft despite their urgency, his hands respectful even in their hunger. Elizabeth had been kissed before, by suitors in Boston, by James on their wedding night, and the dutiful occasions that followed. But never like this. Never as if the person kissing her was discovering something miraculous, something precious. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Isaiah rested his forehead against hers. "We can still stop," he whispered, though his arms tightened around her waist. "We can pretend this never happened." Elizabeth shook her head, her decision made. "I don't want to stop," she said, taking his hand and leading him deeper into the conservatory where a chaise longue sat hidden among towering palms. "I want to feel alive. With you." The air was thick with moisture and the scent of blooming jasmine as they slowly undressed each other. Elizabeth's fingers trembled as she unbuttoned Isaiah's shirt, revealing the smooth expanse of his chest, marked with the scars of his past. She traced each one with gentle fingers, as if her touch could somehow heal the wounds inflicted by a cruel world. Isaiah's own hands were reverent as they freed her from her dress, his eyes asking permission with each new intimacy. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "So beautiful." What followed was everything her marriage had never been: tender, passionate, equal. Isaiah's touch was reverent, his whispered words in her ear like poetry. For the first time, Elizabeth understood what it meant to truly give oneself to another person, body and soul. Their coming together was both gentle and urgent, a communion of bodies and spirits that transcended the arbitrary boundaries society had placed between them. In Isaiah's arms, Elizabeth wasn't a plantation owner's wife or a Boston merchant's daughter. She was simply a woman, discovering the depths of her own capacity for pleasure and connection. And Isaiah, his careful control finally abandoned, showed her a tenderness and passion that made her previous experiences seem like pale shadows. His hands and lips mapped her body as if memorizing every curve and hollow, his whispered endearments making her feel treasured in a way she had never known. When they finally joined, the sensation was so overwhelming that tears sprang to Elizabeth's eyes. Isaiah paused, concerned, but she pulled him closer, urging him to continue. Their movements found a natural rhythm, building toward a crescendo that left them both trembling and transformed. Afterward, lying in his arms amid the humid air and exotic scents of the conservatory, Elizabeth felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "Are you all right?" Isaiah asked, alarmed, propping himself up on one elbow to look into her face. "Did I hurt you?" She shook her head, smiling through her tears. "No, just the opposite." She traced the contours of his face with her fingertips, memorizing him by touch. The strong line of his jaw, the curve of his lips, the slight crease between his brows. "I never knew it could be like this." Isaiah kissed her tears away, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Neither did I. They lay together in comfortable silence for a time, their bodies entwined on the narrow chaise, the night sounds of the prairie filtering through the glass walls of the conservatory. A chorus of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a coyote. Nature's symphony providing a soundtrack to their forbidden union. "Tell me about your life before," Elizabeth said softly, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Where were you born?" Isaiah was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if reaching back through layers of memory. "Virginia," he said. "My mother worked in the big house on a tobacco plantation. My father was the master's son by another slave woman, his half-brother, though no one ever acknowledged it." Elizabeth listened, her hand resting over his heart, feeling its steady rhythm beneath her palm. "My mother taught me to read secretly, using the master's children's discarded primers. She said knowledge was the only thing they couldn't sell away from me." His arm tightened around her. "She was wrong about that. When I was 12, the master died, and his estate was divided. I was sold to a plantation in Missouri, separated from her forever." "I'm so sorry," Elizabeth whispered, the words wholly inadequate for the loss he described. Isaiah shrugged slightly, the movement shifting her head on his chest. "It's the story of countless others. At least in Missouri, my new master recognized my abilities. He used me as a clerk, keeping accounts and writing correspondence. That's where his wife found me and began my real education." They both understood the enormity of what they'd done, the taboo they'd broken, the danger they now faced. Yet in that moment, sheltered by darkness and surrounded by growing things, the outside world with all its cruel divisions seemed very far away. "What happens now?" Elizabeth whispered, reality beginning to intrude as the night grew later. Isaiah's expression grew somber, the carefree intimacy of moments before giving way to the weight of their situation. "Now, I return to the quarters before I'm missed, and you go back to your bedroom. Tomorrow, we pretend nothing has changed." "Everything has changed," she protested, sitting up, the sheet clutched to her chest. "I can't go back to being James's dutiful wife after this. I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel for you." "You must," Isaiah said firmly, though his eyes were gentle. "For both our sakes. Your husband returns in 3 days. If he suspects anything between us—" "I know," Elizabeth interrupted, unwilling to hear the consequences spoken aloud. The thought of returning to James's bed, of enduring his perfunctory attentions after knowing Isaiah's tender passion, made her physically ill. Isaiah sat up beside her, taking her hands in his. "Listen to me, Elizabeth. What happened between us tonight was—" He paused, searching for words. "A gift I never expected to receive in this lifetime. But we live in a world that would destroy us both for it. Then perhaps we need to find a different world," she said, the wild idea that had been forming in her mind all evening finally taking shape. As they reluctantly dressed and prepared to return to their separate worlds, Elizabeth felt the idea growing stronger, more insistent, dangerous, possibly mad, but once conceived, impossible to dismiss. "Isaiah," she said suddenly, catching his hand before he could open the door. "What if we didn't have to pretend? What if we could leave this place?" His expression was a mixture of longing and resignation. "Where would we go? A runaway slave and a plantation owner's wife? There's nowhere in America we could hide." "Not America," Elizabeth said, the plan forming even as she spoke it. "Canada. I have funds of my own, from my mother's estate. James doesn't know about them. My father arranged for them to remain in my name even after marriage. It's enough to get us north, across the border." Isaiah stared at her, hope and fear warring in his eyes. "You would leave everything? Your home? Your position in society?" "This was never my home," she said fiercely. "And what position? Being James Hartwell's possession. I want freedom as much as you do." For a long moment, Isaiah was silent, weighing impossible choices. Elizabeth could see the struggle in his face, the desperate desire to believe in the possibility she offered against the hard-learned caution of a lifetime. "The journey would be dangerous," he said finally, "especially for me. Slave catchers patrol all the routes north, and the new Fugitive Slave Act means even free states aren't safe. If we were caught—" "We won't be caught," Elizabeth interrupted, the certainty in her voice belying her own fears. "There are people who help. The Underground Railroad. My father's sister married an abolitionist. They live in Massachusetts. If we can reach them, they would help us continue to Canada." "Your family would disown you," Isaiah warned, "for running away with a slave. You'd never be able to return to your old life." "I don't want my old life," Elizabeth said simply. The truth of it resonated through her entire being. The society girl from Boston, the obedient daughter and wife, that person already felt like a stranger to her. "I want a new life, with you, if you'll have me." Isaiah's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely tender. "You know I would follow you anywhere, but I need you to be certain. This isn't a decision to make in the heat of passion." Elizabeth turned her face to press a kiss into his palm. "I've never been more certain of anything." Finally, he squeezed her hand. "3 days," he said. "We have 3 days before your husband returns. If you're truly certain this is what you want, we'll need every minute to plan." Elizabeth nodded, her heart pounding with terror and exhilaration. "I'll gather what money and valuables I can without arousing suspicion. And maps. James has maps in his study." "I know the routes the Underground Railroad uses," Isaiah said, his voice dropping to a whisper despite their privacy. "Or, at least, I've heard them discussed among the slaves. There's a station about 30 miles north of here, run by a Quaker family." They spent the next hour planning in hushed voices, aware that each minute together increased their risk of discovery. They would need food, proper clothing, a story to explain their travel if questioned. Elizabeth would take her mother's jewelry to sell if their money ran out. They would travel by night and hide during the day. "We'll leave the night before James is due to return," Elizabeth decided. "That gives us the maximum head start before anyone realizes we're gone." Isaiah nodded, though concern still shadowed his eyes. "If anything goes wrong, if at any point you change your mind—" "I won't," she interrupted, pressing her fingers to his lips. "This is my choice. The first real choice I've made in my life." As they parted ways at the conservatory door, their kiss held the promise of a future neither had dared imagine before. A future they would have to fight for with every ounce of courage and cunning they possessed. "2 nights from now," Isaiah whispered, "meet me here again. We'll finalize everything." Elizabeth nodded, reluctantly releasing his hand. "Be careful." "Always," he promised with a sad smile that spoke volumes about the caution that had governed his entire existence. As she watched him disappear into the darkness, Elizabeth felt a curious mixture of fear and exhilaration. For the first time since coming to Kansas, since her marriage, perhaps since childhood, she felt fully alive. Every sense heightened, every emotion intensified. Whatever dangers lay ahead, she knew she could never return to the half-life she had been living. What they couldn't know was that forces were already in motion that would test that courage to its breaking point, and that their path to freedom would be paid for in blood. For even as they planned their escape, eyes had been watching, ears listening, and the fragile dream they had begun to build together was already in danger. The following day dawned bright and clear. Elizabeth woke early, her body still humming from Isaiah's touch, her mind racing with plans. For the first time in years, she felt fully present in her own skin. At breakfast, Mrs. Winters delivered troubling news. "There's been trouble up north, ma'am. A slave rebellion was put down in Missouri. Miller says they're increasing patrols on all roads heading north." Elizabeth spent the day gathering essentials. Her mother's locket, a small volume of poetry, pearl earrings, and, most importantly, the documents establishing her separate trust. James had never known about this money. Her father, distrusting his son-in-law, had insisted it remain her secret. While retrieving maps from James's study, Miller caught her. "Finding everything you need, Mrs. Hartwell?" "I was looking for my husband's almanac," she lied smoothly. "He promised to lend it to me." Miller's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "In the map drawer?" That night, unable to sleep, Elizabeth penned a coded letter to her aunt in Massachusetts. A message arrived from James, confirming his return the following evening. Time was running short. At dusk, she met Isaiah in the conservatory. His face was grim. "Miller kept me in the fields until sunset. He's watching me, Elizabeth. I think he suspects something." "It changes nothing," she insisted. "If anything, it means we must leave sooner. Tonight, rather than tomorrow." They finalized their plans. Travel north by night, avoid roads, hide during daylight. Elizabeth would wear her plainest dress. Isaiah would don James' old clothes to pass as a free man. "I never thought I could have this," Isaiah murmured as they parted. "A chance at freedom. A woman who sees me as a man, not property." Elizabeth returned to her bedroom to wait for the appointed hour. She dozed off and woke to raised voices. James had returned a day early. "Caught him red-handed," Miller was saying. "Stealing food, clothes, had maps too. Your maps, Mr. Hartwell. Planning to run north." "And you're certain of the rest?" James asked quietly. "Yes, sir. Been watching them for days. Bessie confirmed it. Said Mrs. Hartwell's been sending him private notes, meeting him in the conservatory." Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth. Bessie, the young house slave she had trusted, had betrayed them. "Where is he now?" James demanded. "Locked in the tool shed. 4 men guarding. Him." "Good. Leave him there until morning. I want all the slaves to witness what happens to those who forget their place." Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. She knew what James meant. A public whipping at best, execution at worst. "And Mrs. Hartwell?" Miller asked. "My wife is delicate, easily influenced. She's to be confined to her rooms until I decide how to handle her indiscretion." When James entered her room, his face was a mask of cold fury. "I know everything." "I was helping him gain his freedom," Elizabeth said, offering a partial truth. "Did he touch you?" James demanded. Elizabeth lifted her chin. "Isaiah is a human being, not your property. And what happened between us is none of your concern." The blow came quickly. James's hand caught her across the cheek, sending her stumbling backward. "He dies at dawn," James said flatly. "And you will watch. That's your punishment." After he left, locking her in, Elizabeth made a desperate plan. She tied sheets together to escape through her window, then created a diversion by releasing James's prized horses from the stables. In the ensuing chaos, she broke the padlock on the tool shed. Isaiah was inside, beaten but alive. "Elizabeth, what are you doing here?" "Getting you out. Can you walk?" They fled toward the woods, bullets whistling past them. Isaiah was weakening, his injuries worse than he'd admitted, but they pressed on through the night. Dawn found them hiding in a small copse of trees, miles from the plantation. Isaiah's condition had worsened, fever setting in. "You should go on without me," he urged. "The Quaker settlement can't be more than 20 miles north." By midday, they heard hounds in the distance. James had brought out the dogs. "You have to go," Isaiah insisted. "If you truly love me, you'll go. Reach the Quakers. Continue north." "How can I live that life without you?" she whispered. Isaiah pressed a small wooden carving of a bird into her hand. "To remember that freedom is always possible, even when it seems most distant." With a final kiss, Elizabeth left him, each step feeling like betrayal. She had barely gone a quarter mile when shots rang out behind her. Choking back sobs, she forced herself forward through the tall grass, away from the violence, toward freedom. The wooden bird dug into her palm where she clutched it, its wings forever frozen in flight. Isaiah's final gift to her had been her freedom. She would honor it with every step she took toward a new life, carrying his memory and their shared dream of liberation with her always. Elizabeth trudged across the prairie, the wooden bird clutched in her palm. Each step carried her further from the plantation, from Isaiah's sacrifice. By midday, her throat burned with thirst, her water nearly gone. In the distance, she spotted a small farm. A woman hung laundry while children played nearby. Elizabeth approached cautiously. "Might I trouble you for some water?" she called. The woman, weathered and wary, studied her. "Help yourself. Dippers on the side?" As Elizabeth drank, the woman spoke bluntly. "You're running from something." "My husband," Elizabeth admitted. "He's not a kind man." The woman nodded. "Mine wasn't either, God rest his soul." She gestured to her children. "We manage better without his fists and bottle." Learning Elizabeth sought the Quaker settlement, the woman offered her barn for the night. "I understand wanting to escape. Besides, Ruth Brennan helped deliver all my children. I owe her kindness." At dawn, the woman gave Elizabeth provisions and advice. "Stay off main roads. Slave patrols are thick these days." Following a creek northward, Elizabeth hid twice from distant riders. By sunset, she reached the Quaker settlement, a cluster of buildings surrounding a meeting house. Eli Brennan, a bearded man, greeted her. "What brings thee to our door?" "I seek shelter," Elizabeth replied carefully, "and guidance for a journey north." Inside, Ruth Brennan tended Elizabeth's blistered feet and provided food. When asked her story, Elizabeth explained briefly. "I've left my husband, a plantation owner. I need to reach Canada." "We can help," Eli said, "but the roads are closely watched. It may be some time before safe passage can be arranged." "How long?" Elizabeth asked anxiously. "A week, perhaps 2, he replied. While waiting, Elizabeth met a family of 4, Joseph, Dinah, and their children, Mary and Samuel, who had escaped from Missouri. Elizabeth taught Dinah to read and played with the children, finding purpose in helping them prepare for their journey. On the 7th day, Eli brought news. "A group leaves tomorrow night. Friends will guide you to the next station." The following evening they departed in a covered wagon driven by Friend John. Hours into their journey, riders approached, men searching for runaways. "Seen any strangers? Especially a white woman traveling with slaves, plantation owner's wife from down south, husbands offering a substantial reward." "What does this woman look like?" John asked casually. "Red gold hair, green eyes. Name's Elizabeth Hartwell." After the riders passed, Joseph spoke gravely. "They're looking for you specifically. That makes the journey more dangerous for all of us." That night, Dinah cut Elizabeth's hair short and darkened it with walnut paste. Elizabeth chose a new identity. Sarah Johnson, widowed sister-in-law of Joseph and Dinah. At dawn, they reached the river marking the border to Nebraska Territory. As they crossed by boat, Mary asked, "Are you afraid, Miss Sarah?" Elizabeth considered honestly. "Yes, but being afraid doesn't mean we stop moving forward. Sometimes the things most worth doing are the ones that frighten us most." Stepping onto Nebraska soil, Isaiah's wooden bird secure in her pocket, Elizabeth felt something like hope stirring within her. Freedom was still distant, but with each step, it grew closer, and she was no longer walking alone. 3 weeks after, crossing into Nebraska Territory, Elizabeth, now firmly established as Sarah Johnson, traveled with Joseph, Dinah, and their children in a wagon driven by Lars, a stoic Norwegian immigrant with weathered hands and few words. Their journey had been slow but steady, a series of safe houses connected by guides who appeared and vanished like ghosts in the night, each risking their freedom to help others find theirs. Inside the cramped wagon, Elizabeth taught the children letters using a stick to write in a small box of sand, a clever trick that left no evidence of their educational activities once smoothed away. The children's quick minds absorbed knowledge eagerly, their eyes bright with intelligence despite all they had endured. "Will there be schools in Canada?" Mary asked one afternoon, her small face serious with hope. "Yes," Elizabeth assured her, gently brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead. "Schools where you can learn freely, without hiding, where you can speak in full voice and ask all the questions in your heart." That evening, as they made camp beneath a canopy of rustling leaves, Lars announced, "We're approaching Iowa. Cross the river tomorrow if weather holds and God is kind." His accent made the words sound like a solemn promise. Iowa represented a significant milestone, a free state with stronger abolitionist networks and more established underground railroad routes. From there, they would travel to Wisconsin and then make the final crossing to Canada, where British law would protect them from American slave catchers. "How long to Canada from Iowa?" Joseph asked quietly, his strong blacksmith's hands cradling a cup of thin broth. "3 weeks if all goes well and roads stay clear. Longer if patrol's heavy or weather turns against us," Lars replied, his eyes on the darkening sky. "And winter coming," Dinah murmured, pulling her shawl tighter as she glanced at the leaden clouds gathering on the horizon. "I can feel it in my bones." That night, while keeping watch beneath a silver sliver of moon, Elizabeth was startled by a rustling sound in the underbrush. Her heart pounded as she reached for the small knife Lars had given her. A young black man, hardly more than a boy with terror in his eyes, emerged with a broken chain still attached to his ankle, the metal gleaming dully in the moonlight. "Please," he gasped, his voice barely audible as he collapsed at her feet. "Help me. They're coming." They learned his name was Daniel, a runaway being tracked with dogs across state lines. Without hesitation, Lars immediately doused their fire, his movements quick and practiced. "We move, now. Leave no trace." They traveled through the darkness, avoiding roads and open spaces, the wagon creaking softly as it navigated rough terrain. Elizabeth held Daniel's fevered head in her lap, wiping his brow with a damp cloth as the wagon jolted beneath them. The iron cuff had rubbed his ankle raw, causing an angry infection that threatened to spread. At dawn, hidden in a dense forest glade dappled with early light, Joseph worked carefully to remove the cruel cuff while Dinah prepared herbal remedies from plants she gathered nearby. Daniel, between fits of shivering, shared his harrowing story. Sold twice before his 16th birthday, separated from his family, he had fled impulsively after witnessing the overseer's brutal violence against a friend. Lars returned from scouting with news of a Quaker-operated ferry several miles upstream. The cost of passage was more than their dwindling funds could cover, so Elizabeth made a difficult decision, reaching for the small pouch hidden in her bodice. She sacrificed one of her grandmother's pearl earrings, a treasured heirloom and potential security, as payment for their crossing. The stern-faced ferryman accepted it with a knowing nod but offered a grave warning as twilight gathered around them. "A patrol passed through this morning with hunting dogs and loaded rifles. They specifically mentioned a white woman traveling with slaves, offering substantial reward for information leading to their capture. They seek a plantation owner's wife from Kansas," he added, his shrewd eyes studying Elizabeth's disguised appearance. "A woman who has forsaken wealth and position to help those society deems beneath her." Despite the ferryman's practical suggestion that Elizabeth separate from the group for everyone's safety, she refused firmly. "We stay together. We've come this far as one, and we'll continue that way." They crossed the mighty Mississippi under cover of darkness, the ferry gliding silently across black waters that reflected the stars. When they reached Iowa, a free state at last, Daniel whispered a prayer of gratitude, tears streaming down his face. The ferryman guided them to a secluded cabin where they sheltered for several days while Daniel recovered his strength, then connected them with Solomon, a free black man who transported them hidden among crates of legitimate freight. When early November snow began to fall in earnest, Blanketing the landscape in treacherous white, they sought refuge in New Canaan, a remarkable settlement established by former slaves and dedicated abolitionists. Here, in this hidden community, black and white residents lived as equals under common laws they had established themselves. Elizabeth found purpose teaching at the small school, Daniel discovered a natural talent for carpentry, and Joseph's blacksmithing skills were highly valued by all. Yet troubling reports reached them through the abolitionist network, increased patrols along routes to Canada, stricter enforcement of the hated Fugitive Slave Act, and most disturbing news of a wealthy plantation owner from Kansas who had traveled north himself, offering unprecedented rewards for information about his wife and the slaves who had escaped with her. "James won't give up," Elizabeth said quietly to Reverend Harper, the community's respected leader. "His pride won't allow it. In his mind, I am his property just as surely as any slave." Despite finding acceptance and community in New Canaan, they made the difficult decision to continue to Canada when spring finally softened the frozen landscape. "No place in the United States would truly be safe," Elizabeth explained to the children. "Not while the Fugitive Slave Act remained law and men like James held power." They departed in early April when roads had dried enough for travel, the community gathering to bid them farewell with gifts, prayers, and tearful embraces. Just 2 days from Lake Michigan, with freedom almost within reach, disaster struck without warning. Their wagon hit a deep rut and broke an axle with a sickening crack. Solomon and Joseph volunteered to go to the nearest town for repairs, promising to return by nightfall. When darkness came with no sign of them, Daniel bravely scouted the town and returned with grim news, his young face tight with fear. "Slave catchers in the town square. They have Joseph in chains." Elizabeth made a desperate decision, ignoring the protests of Dinah and Daniel. "I'll go alone to assess the situation. My disguise still holds, and I can move through town without immediate suspicion." In Riverbend, a town hostile to their cause, she discovered a notice nailed to the courthouse door offering a substantial reward for the runaways, and specifically for Elizabeth Hartwell, wife of prominent Kansas plantation owner James Hartwell, believed to be traveling under false identity. At the local hotel, posing as a widow, she learned Joseph was imprisoned in the town jail until his rightful owner arrived to claim him. "Had freedom papers, but they looked forged to most folks," the talkative clerk informed her. "Trial set for tomorrow when the magistrate returns from the county seat." As Elizabeth cautiously eavesdropped in the town's busy restaurant that evening, she overheard men eagerly discussing the reward, $5,000 for her return unharmed, an enormous sum that would tempt even those with moderate abolitionist sympathies. The price on her head was higher than that for all the escaped slaves combined, a fact that revealed James's determination to reclaim his wife at any cost.